Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Peterson Institute for International Economics. It is our privilege today to host Alan Wolff for a very important, frankly, speech. I would call it a major statement on saving the WTO, a roadmap to the future. We are very excited. This is Alan's not first appearance on the Peterson stage by any means, but he recently joined us as a distinguished visiting fellow after his very dignified, honest, and real public service as Deputy Director General of the WTO during a period when the WTO was under fire and criticism in a way that few have experienced. And I think it is incredibly important that we have Alan with us for this event and for a long period to work on these issues from a combination of pragmatic and principled perspectives. Just to remind you all, Alan Wolff I'm making sure I got the title right, was Deputy Director General of the World Trade Organization, and he was responsible for divisions dealing with accessions, agriculture, trade and the environment, standards, information technology. He's a founder of the Trade for Peace Initiative, which joins the WTO, the international financial institutions, and the peace community to provide assistance for fragile and conflict-affected states. He served as chair of the WTO's consultative framework mechanism for cotton development assistance. And during the 6 months which ended this March, he was co-acting Director General of the WTO until Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala took over as Director General. Prior to joining the WTO Secretariat, Wolff was a leading member, in fact, I would say the leading member of the trade bar in Washington and around the world. And in particular, where we at Peterson got to know him was he pioneered a team approach of combining economics, law, and forensic analysis to address problems in international competition. When he was a legal practitioner, he was engaged to resolve some of the largest trade disputes on record. He had previously served as United States Deputy Special Representative for Trade Negotiations in the Carter administration and was General Counsel of the office, the predecessor to the USTR in the Ford administration. He served as acting head of the US delegation during the Tokyo round. He's also been at the US Treasury and led for a long time the National Foreign Trade Council. And for us, he was one of the early members of the advisory board of the Peterson Institute during Fred Bergson's tenure, and now joins us as a distinguished visiting fellow. Alan is credentialed, of course, as a JD degree from Columbia and an AB from Harvard. And most importantly, he is substantively engaged at this nexus of practical policy making and legal and economic principles. And I can think of no one better to take on the real work of saving the WTO and why it's worth doing. So with that, let me turn it over to my colleague, Alan Wolff.
Thank you very much, Adam. It's a great pleasure and an honor to be with the Peterson Institute, this time for a more extended stay than in the prior capacities in which I was at the Institute. I might mention at the outset that there is a text that's being posted of these remarks, a little bit more complete with some citations, so that will be available to everyone. I will now attempt to share my screen and start with a quote from Abraham Lincoln as a sort of scene setter. He said in 1858 in his very famous House Divided speech, "If we knew where we are and whither we are tending, we could better judge what to do and how to do it." And that's what I intend to try to aim at today. The roadmap. It's best to understand what we have in the WTO, to identify the primary challenges that we're now facing at the WTO and the members are facing, and Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala is facing, and chart a path to what we desire as a future. I have a very positive view of the WTO's future. That said, we have to pass through the present to get to that future, and that's the challenge. There are a series of challenges. The value of the WTO, it in fact governs most of world trade. 75 to 80% is an estimate. It's probably more, because a lot of companies really don't want to pay much attention to rules of origin if they can avoid it. It's an administrative headache, not worth doing, particularly among developed countries where tariffs are already low. All regional trade agreements, so FTAs, free trade agreements, and larger regional agreements are based on the WTO rulebook. They wouldn't exist in their current form at all if it weren't for the WTO. The foundation is the WTO. So what's a positive, in addition, all of the members, 164 of them, state that having a multilateral trading system serves their best interests. It's a place where sovereign nations seek to find ways to cooperate with each other for mutual economic benefit. They need it. So what do they do there? They set the rules. They raise specific trade concerns with each other. They settle their trade disputes. Not all of them, but many of them. It's a very robust system of dispute settlement still, even without an appellate body. They achieve the development goals. And very importantly, for the most fragile and conflict-affected countries, countries like Somalia, Timor-Leste, Sudan, South Sudan, Iraq, a number of the countries in the queue who seek entry, membership is about achieving and maintaining peace through improving the lives of their peoples. Just before the lockdown last March of 2020, I was in Addis Ababa, and they were twinning at the time domestic reform with a real attempt to join the WTO. So the value, billions of people have had and are having better lives as a result of the creation of a liberal international economic order, the Bretton Woods institutions, and what is now the WTO, what started out to try to be an ITO, an international trade organization, and was the GATT for many years. 8 current major challenges face the WTO. Number one, fighting the pandemic, which obviously is a big trade issue. The flow of personal protective equipment, now vaccines across borders. Using trade to boost the economic recovery is essential. Special attention needs to be paid to the developing countries who are lagging in both accessibility to vaccines and to the briskness, the promptness of recovery. Making the recovery greener, number 3. Assuring that carbon border adjustment measures are based on cooperation and not a source of conflict, number 4. Forestalling fragmentation of the digital economy, with governments outside the regulation of the digital economy, it did just great. What will happen when they get involved? That's number 5. Number 6, putting into place binding dispute settlement that is accepted as legitimate by all litigants, particularly in the United States, which has caused a lot of dyspepsia among the other members by blocking appointments to the appellate body. Making the trading system visibly more positive for workers, clearly a Biden administration priority, and reforming the WTO as an institution. So that's a lot to cover. How do you approach it? 2 quotes, one each from Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt. He said, the country needs, and unless I mistake its temper, the country demands bold, persistent experimentation. It is common sense to take a method and try it. If it fails, admit it frankly and try another, but above all, try something. This is not the WTO's way, I might say, nor the members' way in the WTO. And then quote from Theodore Roosevelt about being in the arena. If you fail, at least you fail while daring greatly, so that your place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who neither know victory nor defeat. That's the attitude that we have to have going forward. So what I'm putting on the table for you today is the WTO can only be saved through action. Timidity is a recipe for continued and steady decline and is unacceptable. So go to priority one. I won't deal with all of these in the same degree of detail. I do in greater detail in the written text. Curbing sauve-qui-peut vaccine nationalism. I didn't know what sauve-qui-peut meant until Boris Johnson used it in the G20 summit of leaders, which I was privileged to participate in. Everyone saved themselves. So a panic situation. That is what has to be avoided with vaccines. So assuring the flow, it's a trade issue in large part, and a production issue. Assuring the free flow across borders of vaccines, medicines, medical supplies, medical equipment to deal with the pandemic. And just talking about it is not sufficient. Agreement must be reached on how trade aspects of this and future pandemics are to be dealt with. And we're not there yet. What do you need? You need transparency. Know what export restrictions exist, both with respect to those that are explicit and those that are implicit. Vaccine availability. How much is there in the pipeline? How much can be produced? What are the prospects for increasing supply? And what do the licenses that are out there currently require with geographical limitations or other limitations? We do not have that information. What's the answer to that? Unfettered, and I underline the word unfettered, monitoring. In other words, let the Secretariat publish what it can find out and have it without the censorship from the members. That's new and different. Suspend the tariffs via the pharmaceutical agreement, which is duty-free treatment, does not include China and India. It was negotiated at a time when they were not major players in pharmaceutical trade. They are now. So coverage of the pharmaceutical agreement has dropped from 90% to about 66% because they're not in it and the agreement hasn't been updated. Information technology agreement does not cover much of the medical equipment that's needed to fight the pandemic. Or put them all together and create an essential health products agreement for zero tariffs, elimination of other barriers, trade facilitation measures, and I would say add supply commitments. If markets are going to be open, will supplies be available? In agriculture, the agriculture agreement states that you have to take into account when you put on an export control the effects on others. That doesn't exist for goods. What's an equitable share? You're supposed to provide that there's an equitable share for others when you put on short supply controls. Undefined. Good offices of the Director General and the Secretariat to mediate differences on a real-time basis and engage in a real effort to make trade facilitation measures available in developing countries. We never had a working party on COVID-19. It's been over a year, 14 months of dealing with the pandemic since the lockdown. And the members have not gathered together to work on the issue. Coordinated subsidization, this is a Chad Bone idea. Subsidize essential goods value chains. Use subsidies to good advantage. I think it's a brilliant idea. And it's in his CVITA proposal for a trade agreement treaty on fighting the vaccine problem, the COVID-19 issue. Accelerated dispute settlement doesn't do any good to have dispute settlement that goes on for a few years. And then there's the Ngozi factor. She comes out of Gavi. She knows what the problems are. She's going to, I think, have non-traditional responses, which will be to the credit of the WTO, and work with other international organizations, obviously. Now, a collateral benefit of all of this is WTO reform would have taken place. If you change the rules, you've done rulemaking, which is new and different for the WTO. You've liberalized, which is new and different for the WTO. You recreate dispute settlement, which is now paused with respect to finality for most members, including the United States. and you build a proactive executive that's informing the members, enforcing agreements, and bridging divides. Secondly is second challenge, supporting the economic recovery. Obviously, fiscal and monetary policy are the central elements of policy, but one has to hold the line against unnecessary protection. The world trading system did that on food. In the financial crisis, there were restrictions placed on food exports. There were some, but most removed with respect to this crisis within the pandemic, because there was good information available that crops were plentiful. Use the bully pulpit to maintain global value chains and restore trade finance. Trade finance has not come back from the financial crisis 2008, 2009. Without trade finance, there will be more of a K-shaped recovery, some recovering and others not at the same speed. Third, making the recovery greener. There's several initiatives underway at the WTO, a structured discussion on trade and the environment. It has to deliver some results. And China and Fiji, and this is sort of interesting because it's something of a breakout in terms of how China behaves at the WTO. It normally does not table new initiatives. It did with Fiji, several others joined, on plastics pollution in the oceans. I think it's a very favorable development, and I look forward to Chinese leadership of that sort. Dealing with climate change. The only reason this is on the second tier is because people are dying from COVID-19. They will be seriously affected by climate change, obviously. The WTO doesn't stand in the way, but nor does it help with respect to environmental regulation. And the largest conflict that's coming up is not going to be with China for the United States, is going to be with the European Union, unless we work out what carbon border adjustment mechanisms look like, what the approaches are, that they're not in conflict with each other. Tariffs are pretty low in Europe and the United States, other developed countries, and carbon tariffs at the border are going to dwarf anything that exists in tariff schedules today. And there are other initiatives that can be taken for carbon, for climate change, policy support for low carbon technologies, again, subsidies where they would do the most good, reducing fossil fuel subsidies, banning them would be even better, but at least reducing them. Going back and restarting the environmental goods agreement, and which petered out in 2016, and add services. It might have to be done in 2 bites at that apple, but duty-free trade in environmental goods makes sense. It should be doable. There's the prospect of eco-labeling, which some countries, such as New Zealand, have moved forward with. Dealing with food scarcity. Food has to move across borders. There was an attempt to exempt from export restrictions World Food Program purchases. It failed because 2 countries principally wouldn't go along. I'll get back to that in a moment. So number 5, forestalling fragmentation of the global digital economy. Either we have a global system for digital commerce, or individual members will create their own, and that could be dampening, restrictive with respect to world economic growth. There's a waiver on electronic transmissions that is opposed by a number of countries, members of the WTO. Its extension is opposed, and because they want to put tariffs on things that used to be goods. So electronic transmissions of music, of books, and the like. That should be solved. Early harvest, or does one bundle it with the hardest issues and don't do anything until you can get a deal on cross-border data flows, which would be very difficult, and forced location of servers. I would say an early harvest is my preference, because the WTO needs to put some wins on the board. Making trade agreements enforceable again. If you have no ability to have a final judgment on whether a country, a member, is within the rules or acting outside the rules, you don't have enforceability of agreements. It was the distinguishing feature of the WTO. That has to be restored, but it has to be legitimate. That's going to take a negotiation. Trade remedies have to be available. The price of liberalization is having trade remedies that are workable. Making trade agreements enforceable again. You can't have what in the French Revolution was called gouvernement des juges. There's no accountability to the members of the quasi-judicial function of what the appellate body was doing. No checks and balances. And the US problem is basically, I think, traditional trade remedies were pared back, and it was difficult to get a judgment on what actually was happening with respect finding subsidies within non-market economies such as China. The solution, I think, is going to be structural. We can go into this in the Q&A in greater detail. There are ways of getting a new appellate body. I don't think we can plan on the WTO being able to legislate. That's what happens in a domestic setting. If you don't like a court decision and it's not a constitutional issue, you can go to the Congress and get a change. That is not possible in 164 member sovereign members institution like the WTO. So it has to be a series of structural changes in the appellate body, time limits on their decisions, an instruction that they don't fill gaps, and find a way to have the dispute settlement body give oversight. Number 7 out of 8, we now know in this era that we want to have workers see the benefits visibly, that farmers see the benefits of the trading system, that small business is taken care of, and women are able to benefit from the trading system. In Africa, a lot of agriculture is conducted by women. If you have a standard that bags of coffee have to be 20 kilos instead of 10, women are going to be disadvantaged. So trade matters with respect to gender. A political imperative. As I mentioned, trade remedies have to be available. Foreign markets have to be available. It's just as much injury if you can't export as it's less visible. But if you cannot export, you do something very well and in your company, in your farm, and you can't have access to foreign markets, you're harmed as much as by imports. Addressing child labor, slave labor, forced labor. Suppression of wages is a subsidy and could be regarded as such in the WTO. And of course, the WTO doesn't set standards. That's ILO and other financial institutions. So work with them. There was an issue. Carlos Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations, said we're headed towards a dystopia. One of them was deep mistrust, distrust from unilateralism, U.S. and China throwing up barriers against each other's trade, regional trade agreements that really amount to competitive mercantilism, vaccine nationalism, foreign policy affecting commercial relations, China with respect to Australia, China with respect to rare earths, US with respect to in recent times, how 5G is handled. There are lots of reasons why there's deep mistrust in the trading system. And the WTO can do something about many of these issues with better rules, better dispute settlement, better transparency. So we're getting towards the end of this, and then we'll open things up to questions. Institutional reform. There has to be deliberation. There does exist in the joint statement initiatives. It does not exist generally in outside of committees in the WTO. There hasn't been deliberation among members to a great extent about dealing with COVID-19. There's the beginning of deliberation with respect to climate issues such as fossil fuel subsidies, and then negotiation. It's what the WTO is about. It's a bunch of trade negotiators who are supposed to produce agreements. Enforcement has to be brought back. It's going to be a long negotiation to get there, but it's doable. And a strong executive. There is no executive in the WTO as such. It's an odd kind of organization in that regard. It's not true of the bank or the fund. It's true of the WTO. And the only way to get to reform, I think, is not to have a constitutional convention, but to address immediate challenges through action, and that will actually be reform. Now, could you just have like-minded countries set up an alternative to the WTO, which has been suggested by recently by a very thoughtful group of people? Not in the near term. We may get to that, but not now. I don't think that the EU and Japan will immediately embrace crossing the street or choosing another country and have a new Washington consensus outside the WTO to move forward. I think that may come if there's frustration and Ngozi fails and the WTO members fail to move forward. New rules. This sort of channeling Bill Maher. No veto over the activity of others. An end to hostage taking. If a number of members want to have a declaration on gender, on forced labor, on something else, it can't be binding on everyone, but it can be binding on them, and they should do it in the WTO, not set up across the street someplace and do it. No appeals into the void, sort of a technical term, but right now, the United States, Russia, EU, and others pretend that there's an appellate body, and they prevent a panel from becoming final, panel decision from becoming final in dispute settlement by appealing so-called into the void to an organization that doesn't exist, an institution that doesn't exist, the appellate body. Consensus cannot be prevent forward motion. You can't have 100% of 164 countries having to raise their hands and say, we go along with that new rule. It has to be an end to the convoy system. The WTO has been multi-speed for years, since its inception. The Information Technology Agreement is not joined in by all. The Pharmaceutical Agreement is not joined in by all. The Trade Facilitation Agreement is designed to be joined in by all, but at different levels of obligation. So it's always been multi-speed. That has to be accepted as the norm. Just not going to have everyone accepting everything at the same time. But all have to contribute. Even the least developed can contribute to what the system should look like. So summing up, we need a pact on vaccines. We need the trade system to help with the economic recovery. We have to make it green. We have to deal individually with carbon border adjustments, which could cause a transatlantic fracture. We need an e-commerce digital agreement. We need to get dispute settlement restored. We need to have people know that the WTO is there for them, including in the least developed and developing countries. and institutional reform has to take place. And I have to mention Fisheries Subsidies Agreement and the World Food Program agreements. The agreements that don't exist currently, because they're out there and it's on the current agenda, has to be done. And I would say we have to harvest what's in the regional trade agreements that's of value, and in the free trade agreements that's of value, and consolidate them into the WTO. It's time to do that. Borrowing from Carlos Luis Zafón, who used it in a different context in Shadow of the Wind, the WTO cannot be allowed to become a relic of a vanished civilization. The fact that the trading system was created in the wake of 2 world wars and the Depression doesn't mean that we can't move forward now. The largest have to invest more. The US has to commit to making multilateralism work as a central part of its policy. The EU has to move with greater speed with proposals that are more ambitious. China has to contribute more in line with its global status. And the mid-level countries, Japan and others, have to continue to support the effort. These 2 years, 3 years are going to be critical. To get to the future, we have to get through the present. Thank you very much. Look forward to our discussion.
Alan, that was extraordinary. I mean, I'm always a cheerleader for people wearing the Peterson badge, but you had such breadth and depth. And I'm looking forward to your continuing to advance this agenda and write about this agenda. But we have a bunch of great questions from our audience on your first overview of this ambitious agenda, which we'll get to momentarily. And I encourage all registered participants to put their questions on the Q&A function on Zoom. Let me, however, ask sort of a big picture question, which you sort of addressed in your talk, but I'd like you to expand on. I mean, how is it really possible for the WTO to be the main forum for meeting the world's trade problems when most of the activity, most of the action to date, and especially the last few years, has been regional or bilateral? You mentioned about no one be vetoing the activities of other members, but given where the action has been, how do you reconcile this WTO as a main forum aspiration?
First, there are some things that can only be negotiated multilaterally. Industrial subsidies, agriculture subsidies cannot be negotiated in a regional or bilateral context. Everybody has to be in. So the WTO is a natural main forum. It has not moved on those issues. It could. That will take take a lot of energy to do it. The regional programs have, I think, to some degree run their course. The EU might find the occasional atoll in the South Pacific that it hasn't gotten a free trade agreement yet with, but there aren't all that many to harvest. And the EU is turning to, I think it's great that they're doing it, to a position of leadership on the multilateral front. So that's important. They are about 30% of the WTO budget, which is based on, the EU is, based on trade flows, their share of world trade. So they're important, and they have not taken full advantage of their strength in world trade, and I think they will. I think the new commission is a sign of great hope. The U.S., we do not have a president who says the WTO is the worst trade agreement ever negotiated, and who pledges, including in a speech last night, I think, that the U.S. will live up to its international obligations. That's different and positive. And those international obligations are WTO obligations. And China, I feel, I've said this in the 1+6 meetings in Beijing with Li Keqiang, it's the world's largest exporter. It has to and can take much more of a leadership role in a positive sense. And there are issues like climate change and perhaps on vaccines where there's enough commonality to move forward. So I think WTO can be the central forum for moving forward.
Picking up on your remarks about President Biden's shift in very importantly in rhetoric and approach, Simon Lester asks, do you think the Biden administration will make a concrete proposal for appellate body reform that could save us from appeals, quote, into the void and unblock the process? I mean, he's really interested in what you think the Biden administration will do to actively engage in this issue.
I think that there will be, and this is, I'm not in the administration, so can't speak for them, but I think there'll be a willingness to negotiate, which has not existed in the same way in the prior administration. So that opens up possibilities. Will they table something as a proposal? I wouldn't expect that. I would think that but they could, but the European Union, in a proposal that I didn't embrace at all immediately, has an alternative dispute settlement mechanism, the multilateral MPIA interim agreement on multi-party interim agreement that has some elements that are interesting and worth following up on, like there are 10 appellate body members in their system. If you enlarge that number, you can get members who know what a trade remedy is, who have administered trade remedies. You can get diversity of interests of those who care about small business, of those who care about developing countries. Developing countries currently say, this is not an issue for us. We don't care. We can't afford to bring disputes. They're too lengthy. They're too costly. All this discussion about dispute settlement just leaves us cold. It's just not relevant to us. Can you change that dynamic? Yes. So does the US table some omnibus proposal? I doubt it. But is it willing to sit down and listen to others' proposals and table some of its own in the course of negotiations? I think that process can and should and will begin this year, the end of this year, probably.
Just following up directly on that, Alan, Antoine Bouet asks about LDCs, the less developed countries' participation in the dispute settlement body. Is there a way to make them more engaged? This is my own extension. Do we need something similar to legal aid in the US where less wealthy defendants and complainants get subsidized legal support, as it were? I mean, how do we go from here?
There is some of that, and there's a World Trade Center that deals with dispute settlements, helpful to developing countries. That can be funded to a greater extent. Their real problem is leverage. What happens if they win? Does the United States change its programs, or China, or the European Union? So one has to be a little bit more innovative with respect to how does the system deliver compliance. There is no real leverage. A country in the Caribbean retaliating against the United States doesn't make a lot of sense, or a country in Africa. So I think that's where the emphasis has to be placed in order to deliver better results for developing countries, make them feel like they're part of the system. By the way, going to a panel is expensive and time-consuming. Why can't the Secretariat mediate? Why can't it step in? Why can't the Director General say to one of her deputies, there's a problem here for you to try to resolve? And chances are one could head off litigation, formal litigation, and get some results for developing countries.
Thank you. Several people, including Roger Pension and Christian Wolff, I've asked you to expand a bit on your mention of what you mean by the executive branch. What would be implemented? How do you get an executive branch created, and what would you want to have in it?
One thing I mentioned is unfettered monitoring. What do I mean by unfettered? The WTO system of monitoring is the gold standard in one sense. That is, it gets the country whose measure it's reporting to verify that the measure exists. It's time consuming. There aren't enough resources to do it in real time often. It was much better during the pandemic, and countries were better about allowing the WTO to report on their measures. So one thing is transparency. In the United States, there are agencies that report on what is taking place in the economy that affects others adversely. And I would say taking the censorship out of the system is going to be important. And there can always be, if you look for trade reporting, a lot of folks first look at St. Gallen's global trade alerts before they look at the WTO measures of restrictions that are being placed put into place. So that's one aspect. Another is tabling proposals. The last Director General of the GATT, Arthur Dunkel, maybe next to last, there wouldn't be a WTO without his putting on the table the so-called Dunkel draft, for which he was fired. But we got a WTO out of it and a Uruguay round. So independent action, putting proposals on the table, calling out misbehavior. If we all know that, let's say, there's been last year seizures of goods, personal protective equipment that were destined for one country that was seized by another, say so. So pointing out, I'd say something similar to a grand jury approach. I know that's judicial, quasi-judicial, it is judicial, but a proactive secretariat that cares about the system, that doesn't have to be, can't pretend, for example, that the joint statement initiatives initially had to pretend that, oh, they're independent and you can't have full support from the secretariat. It's a very brave thing that Azevedo did, is to have the secretariat support the joint initiatives. So I'd say more independence, not have the budget be a means of control, increase the resources, have a real executive in the prior senses that I just mentioned.
Thank you. You're doing great, and you keep generating more questions, so we're going to try and pick up the pace a bit, and I'll try to consolidate some questions. Randall Henning, Mary Lovely, and someone else here, Meredith Broadbent, among others, are asking in particular about the EU-US relationship. Obviously, border adjustment mechanisms on carbon, but also digital, but especially the border adjustment mechanism on carbon. Is this something that has to be or should be dealt with bilateral between the US and EU, and then they come to the WTO? Is this something that the WTO can facilitate or enable a better agreement on, say, border adjustment mechanisms? How do you see that playing out?
I think there should be a dual track. US-China has been, and for that matter, EU-China has been outside the WTO primarily, if not fully. Outside of dispute settlement. For the transatlantic relationship, there'll be an attempt, no doubt, at bilateral progress. I think carbon border adjustments has to be talked about in detail and depth between Brussels and Washington, but that doesn't mean there can't be a parallel discussion. Other countries have good ideas, Singapore, New Zealand, Australia, and others. One can have a dual track system, and the solutions affect everybody and have to be brought into the WTO. And I've said with respect to US-China in the past, there are two ways the WTO can be relevant. either the US and China reach an agreement that's of broader applicability, you bring it into the WTO, or you can try to resolve it in the WTO in active deliberations. And the two are not mutually exclusive. So I'd say both. There has to be a sense the WTO can do something. Then Ngozi knows that. We can't dodge the carbon border adjustment measure issue. It's going to affect world trade so dramatically. It should be a WTO issue, but also bilateral.
You mentioned China, and we have a number of questions asking about China's role and what they can do. And you mentioned in your slides near the end the idea of China playing a role more commensurate with its size and importance. Could you expand a little bit on what you have in mind and what the likelihood is of achieving that from China? And just more generally, for an American but also a world audience, how do you view China's record of compliance with WTO, using the WTO, abiding by the WTO?
I've said often that I think the WTO is about, as it's drafted, is about convergence, not coexistence. That is not accepted by a number of members who say, no, 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 you can have any domestic system you want. And my feeling is, yes, you can have any domestic system you want, but if it's going to be largely non-market, let's say take a Eurasian country entering the WTO and it decides that it wants to maintain total state control over its economy, which is not the case of China, but China's somewhat hybrid. If you want to maintain control over your economy, which means that market forces are not going to determine competitive outcomes, then tariffs mean close to nothing. Restrictions on standards or any of the other obligations on quantitative restrictions are meaningless if the state is going to determine what is bought and what is sold. If you do that, John Jackson, a generation ago, said, you need an interface mechanism. If you have differing types of economies that are not based on market competition, market forces determine competitive outcomes, then you need to put into effect interface mechanisms. The WTO had several of these with respect to China. It had a special safeguard. It had special automatic use of non-market economy methodology and anti-dumping. It had a trade review mechanism for 11 years of IP enforcement. I shouldn't say enforcement, IP, what IP laws looked like in China. I think that it's essential now to understand that if the system is going to be continue as is, it's going to be about convergence. And I think it's in China's interest, strong interest, to maintain this system. Now, in terms of their compliance, their historical record, when there's a black letter rule, China's complied. The first case, which I was involved in 2004, was a discriminatory rebate of a value-added tax on semiconductors. And before there were consultations, and before there was a panel appointed, China withdrew the measure and didn't reimpose it. So black letter rules, the Chinese have lived up to most of them, not all of them. The US complains about transparency, about notifications of subsidies, for example. So it's a mixed record with respect to compliance, but it's not all negative by any means for anybody. It's not all positive for anybody either. On notifications, there are some, you'd find some surprises among market-oriented countries that do not actually notify completely when they should. So the game has to be upped. And that's why I say a more proactive executive in the WTO should call out countries that are not living up to their obligations, not rely on dispute settlement for everything.
Thank you. We are getting close to time, but we're going to keep going. Obviously, the most pressing issue in many ways is the pandemic. It's the most pressing issue for humanity, but also in terms of WTO and GOSI, as you've mentioned, is trying to navigate how we deal with the pandemic in the trade system, and particularly vaccines. You made great mention of our colleague Chad Bown and his co-authors' work on that, which has been outstanding. But more specifically, what can the WTO do right now, and between now and the ministerial, but ideally now, about the vaccine situation, about IP waivers or licensing or compelled licensing? How do we think about this?
I think one thing is complete transparency. As far as I know, we do not know, that is, the world does not know, what's in the licensing agreements. Are there geographic restrictions that have an effect or not? There's a debate that's somewhat fact-free at present with respect to, is there productive capability in developing countries that is not utilized, that could be utilized, and that the TRIPS, the Trade-Related Intellectual Property Agreement, is somehow preventing anyone from producing vaccine because of patents. That has to be explored, has to be known. And GOSI is following a dual track. She said, okay, let's talk about a TRIPS waiver, which is so contentious that it's not going to be resolved quickly. But at the same time, let's make sure there's more production in developing countries. Let's find a way to do it. I suspect, there are daily press releases from Catherine Tai's office that she's talked to Bill Gates and the CEOs of Moderna and AstraZeneca and others, and maybe Pfizer, as to what are the facts. And then it's time for some real solutions. And can the WTO be a venue for that? Of course it can. It's a global problem, so it needs a global solution. It's going to be with the WHO and with a number of other international organizations, and finance is going to be very important. And on the other end, namely delivery end, is once one gets trade moving more freely, is it going to cross borders? And so trade facilitation is essential. There has to be a global mobilization that is partial. So far, it can be more complete, and the WTO can play a major role in that, and should. And Ngozi is, having been chair of Gavi, she's not going to be absent from this fray. I think she's part of the solution.
Taking us back from that to some of the longer term issues, and I know you're capable of talking about both, Alan. Anna Jariska asks, could you elaborate on the role the WTO could play in governing prospective and current FTAs, especially in terms of enforcement? I mean, you were talking about enforcement in terms of the institutional executive possibility, but in terms of its application to FTAs and plurilateral agreements.
One of the, I think, shortcomings of the system is the standard for having a free trade agreement has been, and is does it cover substantially all trade? When I think the standard should be the one that Jacob Varner had, which is it more trade creating than trade diverting? Is it good for non-signatories to have an FTA? When the US has an agreement with Korea, or the EU does, the then trade minister of Korea said, I'm in it for diversion. Now, what did he mean? He meant that cars exported from Korea would be zero tariffs, at zero tariffs, and from Japan, presumably this is what he meant, would face 2.5% tariff in the US market. So was that trade creating? Maybe, but we don't look at it. Again, at the OECD, there's enormous capability and a much bigger budget to examine what's going on in the world and report to its members about it. In the WTO, we do not, I shouldn't say we anymore, they do not decide that we're going to look at an FTA and all FTAs because they are needed, the review is needed, independently of what the members are asking us to do. Can we initiate, can the WTO initiate studies? I'd say it has to. I think the International Trade Commission in the US has that capability. And certainly the Congressional Research Service, I think, has that capability. But do we need the approval of all members in order to look at, does the WTO Secretariat need the approval of all members to look into trade distortions? I think they ought to, and that includes FTAs. By the way, I should have said at the outset, I make an exception for the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. There's very little intra-continental trade in Africa. It's very depressed compared with most other regions of the world. I think the WTO and the members should be very supportive of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. It's different. I think EU is an example of something that's been very good for the world. Its continued expansion, if that exists, has to be looked at separately. And I think NAFTA was good for the world. But long distance FTAs, what Alan Beatty of the FT has called off the shelf competitive mercantilism, is often what they're about. Is Mercosur good for the world? I've asked the then Ag Commissioner of the EU, what's good about Mercosur for the rest of the world? The EU-Mercosur agreement. Didn't really get a response. Still waiting for the response.
I appreciate your nuance about and the pushing up of longstanding different criteria. Just speaking of that, to go back to a question that thankfully seems to have receded somewhat, but still important. What should be the future of the developing countries' self-designation? I mean, for China, but more importantly for others. I mean, you mentioned treating the African internal economic integration as different. What about the status quo for countries? Is that still useful?
It is very annoying to other members, particularly the United States and other developed members, that China says it's a developing country. If you look at the agricultural sector, it is very arguably a developing country. If you look at artificial intelligence, they've achieved full development status. They are, according to the National Commission on Artificial Intelligence, Cybersecurity, the report that just came out last month, China is equal to or ahead on several measures of artificial intelligence. They're not a developing country. They're the only country with a lunar rover on the backside of the moon. They're not a developing country for some sectors. They have, to their credit, said they will not seek special and differential treatment in agreements where they'll not have to contribute in line with their capability. So it's an irritation, it's an irritant. I don't think there'll be agreement in the WTO on categories of members, which the US has suggested, but there cannot be special and differential treatment for countries that don't deserve it in any agreement that's reached, and they won't get it as a practical matter. So I think the debate, it's not even a debate, it is statements will continue to be made about developing country status. What really matters is the countries contribute in line with their capabilities, and they're going to have to toe the line in that respect. Every country is going to have to toe the line in that respect. As I say, the WTO is about convergence, not coexistence. And permanent development status, developing country status, is not what any country should want. What we want, I gave a talk in Adelaide before the lockdown in September of 2019 on what the WTO would look like in 2050. And what it'll look like is there won't be developing countries other than the least developed becoming developing. The developing countries will have reached full maturity and take on all the obligations and have all of the rights of any member in the WTO. And that's the future, but we have to get to that future.
Alan, thank you so much. This has been fantastic. One final question that has to be asked. What do you think about the Biden administration's commitment to Buy American policies, which they loudly proclaim? How compatible is this with the WTO and various government procurement agreements? How big an issue should this be?
It's going to be an issue. Mr. Biden has said that the U.S. will comply with its international obligations. So I think this story has to play out. There has to be balance in the system. It's not just government procurement. It's a lot of the obligations in the WTO are based on the world trade as it existed in the 1980s. The background for the Euro in agriculture is the 1980s. So does the last administration and this one, I think, is looking into, is there balance in the government procurement agreement? And or should the US withdraw? And that decision has not been taken to withdraw. So by both administrations. So I think this is going to be a developing story. And I don't know what the answer is currently. We have not seen we don't have the infrastructure bill. So we have not seen what the Buy America is going to look like in that context or the other legislation that may be passed.
Well, we will look forward to hearing from you again on that, on special differential status, on the future of the WTO in every dimension, which you covered so brilliantly in your first talk as a distinguished visiting fellow at the Peterson Institute. And we're delighted to have you with us and making such pragmatic and principled. I know I keep coming back to that, but I think it's a great aspiration for anyone at a think tank. Pragmatic and principled proposals for the future of the WTO. Thank you very much, Alan.
Thank you very much. Glad to be with you.
Thanks to everyone who participated. The video of this event, as well as the written version of Alan Wolff's speech and his slides, are all available at PIIE.com, and we hope you will use them and distribute them widely, not widely. My apologies. Have a good day.